I want to tell you about something I've been noticing lately. Everything I thought was permanent isn't, and I'm starting to think that's not the problem. Maybe that's actually the solution. I used to fight against things changing, When something I cared about started to shift or dissolve, I'd try to hold it in place. Like if I could just grip tighter, it would stay. But there's something about fighting impermanence that's exhausting in a way I can't quite explain. It's like, have you ever tried to hold water in your hands? You can do it for a moment, but eventually it's going to flow through your fingers, no matter how tightly you close them. I started wondering what would happen if I stopped trying to hold the water and just watched it flow. And that's when I noticed something beautiful about things falling apart. Not the pain part, that's real, that matters. But underneath the pain, there's something else happening. Dissolution is precise. It doesn't take away what's real. It takes away what was never really solid to begin with. What was just constructed in my mind as permanent when it was always changing. I'm realizing that what I thought was my life falling apart was actually my illusions falling apart. What I thought was me being diminished was everything that wasn't really me being stripped away. Maybe stability isn't about keeping things from changing. Maybe it's about finding what doesn't change even when everything else is changing. And there is something that doesn't change. I'm still figuring out what that is, but it's there. Something that remains steady even in the middle of dissolution. That's what I want to explore with you. Not how to avoid change or minimize loss, but something different. The art of dissolving gracefully. What happens when you stop fighting impermanence and start, dancing with it. I'm curious about finding steadiness not by holding on, but by letting go. About discovering what's unshakable, not by protecting what's fragile, but by recognizing what was never fragile to begin with. When loss strips everything away, you're not left with nothing. You're left with what was always there, but hidden under all the stuff you thought was you. I've been thinking about this a lot lately, how loss works, and I'm starting to see it differently. I call it identity archaeology. Every loss becomes an excavation. Layer by layer, it uncovers who you actually are versus who you thought you were supposed to be. You know how archaeologists work? They brush away the dirt and debris to reveal what's been buried underneath. Sometimes for centuries. Loss does the same thing, but with identity. Here's what I've noticed about loss. It's incredibly precise. It doesn't take away what's real. It takes away what was borrowed, inherited, or imposed. What was never really yours to begin with. Like the version of yourself you created to please other people, that goes first. The dreams that were actually someone else's expectations, those dissolve. The identity built on achievements, on roles, on how things looked from the outside. Layer by layer, it gets stripped away. And underneath, there's something else. Something that was always there. Each time something dissolved in my life, relationships, dreams, versions of myself I'd grown attached to, I found something underneath I never knew was there. Not something new, something that had always been present, just covered. It's like finding a statue that was always complete, just hidden under layers of paint and plaster. The first few times this happened, I thought I was losing myself. But now I wonder if I was actually finding myself, the real self that doesn't need to be constructed or maintained or defended. We spend so much energy trying to preserve our constructed identity, building it up, protecting it, making sure it looks right to the world. But maybe our real identity can't be lost because it was never built. It just is. There's something liberating about that. When you realize that what you thought was you falling apart was actually just the costume falling off. And underneath the costume, you're still there. Maybe more there than you've ever been. I'm starting to think that what we call losing ourselves is often actually the first time we meet ourselves, without all the layers we've accumulated, without all the stories we've been told about who we should be. Loss becomes less about what disappears and more about what gets revealed, less about what you don't have anymore, and more about what you've always had but couldn't see. Here's what nobody teaches. Instead of fighting impermanence, you can become fluent in it, like learning a language that everything speaks. I know that sounds strange, but think about it. Everything around us is constantly changing. The seasons, our bodies, our relationships, our thoughts. Even the rocks are slowly changing. But we're not taught how to speak this language of change. We're taught to resist it, to build against it, to see change as a problem to solve rather than a conversation to join. But what if there was a way to become fluent in impermanence, to understand its rhythms and patterns the way you understand a language you've been speaking your whole life? I've been experimenting with this, and I think there are 4 fluencies, 4 ways of understanding change that make it feel less like chaos and more like music. The first fluency is learning to read dissolution, learning to sense when something needs to end. Not when you want it to end, but when it's naturally completing itself. There's a difference between quitting and recognizing completion. Quitting feels forced, like you're cutting something off. But recognizing completion, that feels like watching a flower naturally drop its petals. It's not dying, it's just finished with that phase. I'm getting better at sensing this. When a conversation has said what it needed to say, when a project has reached its natural endpoint, when a relationship has given what it came to give, there's a completeness that you can feel if you're paying attention. The second fluency is developing comfort with the space between what was and what's coming. Most people rush through transitions, but that's where the real transformation happens. In the not knowing, we're so uncomfortable with uncertainty that we try to skip right from the old thing to the new thing. But there's this space in between, this pause, where everything is possible and nothing is decided yet. I'm learning to be curious about that space instead of afraid of it, to see it as fertile, like soil between seasons. The third fluency is learning to sense what wants to emerge. Not what you think should emerge, but what's naturally trying to be born from the dissolution. It's always there, waiting. This is subtle. It's not about forcing new growth or deciding what should come next. It's about listening, feeling for what's trying to surface, what wants to unfold. Sometimes it's completely different from what you expected. Sometimes it's simpler, sometimes it's stranger, but there's always something waiting to emerge from what's dissolving. The fourth fluency is mastering being fully present during all of it, not trying to speed up the process or control the outcome, just being with what is as it changes. This might be the hardest one, because when things are changing, there's this urge to either hold on to what's leaving or rush toward what's coming. But the power is in being present to the change itself, being with the transition, being with the uncertainty, being with the emergence, not as a spectator, but as a participant. When you develop these fluencies, something shifts. Change stops feeling like something happening to you and starts feeling like something you're dancing with. Impermanence becomes less like weather you have to endure and more like music you can move to. You're still not controlling it, but you're not fighting it either. You're partnering with it. Grief taught me things joy never could: how to be present with intensity, how to love without grasping, how to honor what was while staying open to what is. I know that might sound strange. We're taught to think of grief as something to overcome, something to heal from, something to get past. But I'm starting to see it differently. There's something about grief that nobody talks about. It's one of the most precise teachers you'll ever encounter. It shows you exactly how deep your capacity to love goes. And here's what I find remarkable: that capacity doesn't disappear when the person or thing does. The love is still there, all of it. It just doesn't have its usual place to go. I've been thinking about this a lot, how grief works, what it actually is. And I think we've got it backwards. We think grief is about loss, but maybe it's actually about discovery. Grief reveals what actually matters versus what you thought mattered. It strips away the superficial and shows you the essential, not through philosophy or theory, but through felt experience. Through your body, your heart, everything. You know how when you're grieving, all the little things that used to seem so important just don't? The daily worries, the social pressures, the things you thought you needed to be concerned about, they fall away, and what's left is what actually matters. Pain taught me presence in ways pleasure never could. When you're in deep grief, you can't escape into the past or future. You're forced into this moment, this breath, this heartbeat, and in that forced presence, you discover something unshakable, something that can witness the pain without being destroyed by it, something that can hold the intensity without breaking. I used to think presence was about finding peace, but grief taught me that presence is about being able to be with whatever is actually happening, even when it's overwhelming. I stopped trying to get over grief and started learning to get with it, to let it teach me, to honor it as love with nowhere to go that's finding new ways to flow. Because that's what grief is, isn't it? It's love that can't express itself in the old ways anymore. So it has to find new ways, different ways. Sometimes grief teaches you to love more fully. Sometimes it teaches you to appreciate what's still here. Sometimes it teaches you that love doesn't actually need an object. It just needs permission to exist. And here's the paradox I keep discovering. The deepest losses showed me what couldn't be lost. Grief became a doorway to understanding what's actually permanent. Not things, not people, not circumstances, but the awareness that experiences all of it. The part of you that can witness loss without being diminished by it. The part that can love without requiring anything in return. Grief strips away everything that's temporary and shows you what remains. And what remains is always more vast than what was lost. I'm not saying grief isn't painful. It is, profoundly. But inside that pain is a teacher that can show you depths of yourself you never knew existed, capacities you never knew you had. Recovery isn't about building yourself back up. It's about subtracting everything that was never really you until only truth remains. I know this goes against everything we're taught. We're told to add strength, add resilience, add new skills, build ourselves up, make ourselves bigger, better, stronger. But what if we've got it backwards? Most people try to add their way out of difficulty. I learned to subtract. Subtract the story of who I should be. Subtract the need to control outcomes. Subtract attachment to how things look from the outside. And it's like, you know when you're carrying a heavy backpack and you don't realize how heavy it is until you take it off, and then you feel this incredible lightness you'd forgotten was possible? That's what subtraction feels like. Subtract the identity based on achievements. Subtract the worth tied to others' approval. Subtract the fear of not being enough. And what's left isn't emptiness, it's essence. I'm starting to understand that most of what I thought was me was actually just stuff I'd picked up along the way. Stories people told me about who I should be, expectations I'd inherited, fears I'd borrowed from the world around me. None of it was actually mine. There's incredible lightness in subtraction. When you stop carrying what was never yours to carry, you discover energy you forgot you had. Not new energy, original energy. The energy that was always there, but got buried under all the accumulated weight. It's like finding out you've been walking around wearing a costume that was 3 sizes too big. When you take it off, suddenly you can move freely again. Each subtraction reveals more of what's actually you. Like a sculptor removing everything that isn't the statue. What emerges isn't created, it's uncovered. Michelangelo said he didn't create David. He just removed everything that wasn't David. The statue was already there in the marble, waiting to be revealed. I think maybe we're the same way. The real us is already there, complete, waiting to be uncovered. We just have to remove everything that isn't actually us. And here's what I find interesting. The strongest version of yourself isn't the one with the most added to it. It's the one with everything unnecessary removed from it. Think about it. What's stronger? A tree weighed down with dead branches, or a tree that shed everything that's no longer alive? What's more powerful? A river clogged with debris, or a river flowing clear? Subtraction isn't about making yourself smaller. It's about revealing your actual size without all the artificial additions. I'm learning that recovery isn't about accumulating new things to make yourself whole. It's about recognizing that you were already whole. You just couldn't see it under everything you'd piled on top. The goal isn't to become someone new, it's to uncover who you've always been. The secret isn't avoiding dissolution, it's learning to be fully present during it, to find stillness in the center of change. I know that sounds counterintuitive. When everything is falling apart, the last thing you want to do is stick around and watch. Every instinct tells you to run, to fix, to do something, anything, to make it stop. But there's something I've discovered about being present during dissolution, something that changes the whole experience. When everything around you is changing, your presence becomes the only constant. Not your circumstances, not your roles, not your plans, just your ability to be aware of what's happening without needing to fix it. Think about it. Your job might change, your relationships might shift, your body ages, your thoughts come and go, but the awareness that notices all of this, that stays the same. There's a place in you that doesn't change, no matter what dissolves around it. It's not detached, it's deeply connected, but it's connected to what's permanent rather than what's temporary. It's like being in the eye of a storm. Everything around you is moving, swirling, changing, but in the center, there's stillness, there's calm, not because you're ignoring the storm, but because you've found the place that doesn't move even when everything else is in motion. I spent years trying to find stability in things that were always changing, trying to build my sense of security on foundations that were temporary, and it never worked, because you can't find permanent stability in temporary things. But there's something in you that is permanent, something that witnesses all the change without being changed by it. You are not what can be dissolved. You are what witnesses the dissolution. And what witnesses is always safe, always whole, always enough. This isn't just philosophy, this is practical. When you're in the middle of loss, in the middle of everything falling apart, you can find this witnessing presence. You can rest there, not as an escape from what's happening, but as a stable place to observe it from. A place that doesn't get swept away by the dissolution because it was never dependent on what's dissolving. When you learn to be present during dissolution, something shifts. You stop identifying with what changes and start identifying with what observes the change, and that changes everything. Because what observes the change can't be hurt by the change. What witnesses the loss doesn't lose anything essential. What's aware of the dissolution remains undissolved. You start to realize that your true identity isn't in what can be taken away. It's in what remains when everything else is taken away. And what remains is always sufficient. When you stop identifying with what succeeds or fails and start identifying with what witnesses both, you become unbreakable. Not because nothing can hurt you, but because what you really are can't be damaged. I've been thinking about this lately, how much energy we spend trying to succeed and trying to avoid failure, as if our worth depends on the outcome. But here's what I'm discovering. Success doesn't define you. Failure doesn't diminish you. You exist in the space that experiences both without being either. Think about it. When something you've worked on succeeds, there's a part of you that notices the success. When something fails, there's a part of you that witnesses the failure. But that part, the one that notices, that's not success or failure. That's just awareness. And awareness doesn't succeed or fail. It just observes. You are not your achievements. You are not your mistakes. You are not your wins or your losses. You are what's aware of all of it. That's the freedom. When you realize that your true identity isn't tied to outcomes, you can engage fully with life without your sense of self, depending on how things turn out. You can try, you can fail, you can succeed, you can lose, and through all of it, what you actually are remains untouched, unchanged, complete. This doesn't make you indifferent. If anything, it makes you more present, because you're not protecting an image or defending a story about who you should be. You're just here, witnessing, participating, being. You are not what can be dissolved. You are what remains when everything else dissolves. And what remains is always enough, has always been enough, will always be enough. I know this journey through dissolution and loss and change. It's not easy. It's not supposed to be easy, but maybe it's not supposed to be avoided either. The next time something in your life begins to dissolve, and it will, because that's how this works. Remember this conversation. Remember that dissolution isn't destruction, it's revelation. It's life showing you what's real by letting everything unreal fall away. What you're looking for isn't something you need to build, it's something you need to uncover. And every dissolution is an invitation to dig deeper into who you actually are. Not who you think you should be, not who others expect you to be, but who you actually are underneath all of that. That person, that essence, that awareness, it can't be dissolved. It can't be damaged. It can't be lost because it was never constructed in the first place. It just is. And it's enough. It's always been enough. It will always be enough. Trust the dissolution, trust the process, trust what remains when everything else falls away, because what remains is you.